Hi, everyone. I am Frances Harrell. I'm one of the advisors for this project, and I also uh, was the project lead on the NEH grant that created the peer assessment framework that you're going to be using as a part of this project. So what I wanted to do was give you a couple um, what I hope are helpful walkthroughs of the assessment framework itself, and then another walkthrough of sort of how to take the framework and use it with another institution that you'll be, engaged with as a peer. And it's very similar to kind of being a consultant with a client. But in some, pretty key ways, it'll be different because you'll also be kind of working through your own questionnaire, your, kind of own assessment with your peer as well. So anyway, this is the first little walkthrough that I wanted to present to you, which is really just going a little bit deeper into the sections of the assessment framework itself. As always, I encourage you to read through the introduction of the framework itself, because it really does go over a lot of what I'm going to talk through. So you can use that to refer to that to in the future. And in each section, there's also guidance for kind of good practice scenarios, what we would like to see happening in smaller institutions, as well as guidance on, how to ask questions, how to use different recommendations. So that piece I'll be going over in the next walkthrough. This one is really just going to be about the content of the framework itself. So there are 5 facets to the assessment framework. These are kind of the overarching categories in which you will be seeking information from your peer and trying to work with them on identifying some priorities for improvement. Each section has several subsections. So I'm just going to go through them at this top level, and there's some subsections that are a little less straightforward, or I felt like could use a little more explanation. So I'll talk about some of them, but I'm not going to go through every subsection for all of the facets. And like I said, there is written guidance in the framework that you can use to help yourself understand the kind of landscape for each facet itself. And I would also encourage you, if any part of the framework is confusing, to work with your cohort facilitator on really trying to nail that down for yourself and your partner. That's what your facilitator is there for. They will be very helpful for you. So the first section is called the organization. So the assessment starts with really trying to understand the organization as a whole. The collections section is really, trying to identify what is in the collections and how are they brought together. You want to think about how the institution is organized, and that means both sort of formally and informally. Do they have a larger body that they're a part of that needs to be taken into account when you're thinking about changes and improvements? Are there, outside organizations that are really important to consider? What's the board? Is there a board of directors? Is, all the various organizational structure questions? What planning has been done for digital preservation? So that's kind of thinking about, is there a strategic plan for this program? Has there been some efforts in the past that have maybe foundered for some reason? We move through to the mission and vision section, which is really about is the mission supporting the program? Does the program exist outside of a strong mission statement? Is there a lack of a strong mission statement? So there's some guidance in the framework about, how to identify that. But I would encourage you too to reflect on your own work when you're looking through this at other institutions. Has it been helpful in the past to have a really good mission statement? What makes a good mission statement for your daily work? The designated community is a concept that was introduced in one of our kind of seminal documents, the Open Archival Information Systems Framework reference model. And it encourages us to think very specifically about who our users are now and in the future, and to kind of stay away from a really overly broad understanding of who those people are. And many libraries often default to an everyone kind of position, but that does make it really difficult to evaluate your programs, whether you're actually serving your intended audience, and plan for decades in the future. So we encourage really taking a close look at who the community actually is. And then a very important part of the assessment process for peer cohort groups, as well as when a consultant is working with a collection, with an institution, is thinking about what organizational strengths exist in the institution. Because a lot of the assessment is focused on a gap analysis, where are skills missing, where are practices missing, but the strengths is equally important. And that's starting to think about what resources exist within the organization that can be built upon. So just a couple of deeper thoughts about a couple of these sections. It's very important to get an organizational structure document. So even if there isn't an official org chart like this is written, try to work with your peer partner to sketch one out. It becomes very important when you're thinking about staffing and staff roles and where decision-making happens within the organization to have this as a written reference. So get the official one if you can, if there is an official one. And if there isn't an official one, really try to work together to sketch it out with names and positions. And always include empty positions or vacant positions that have been unfilled for some reason or are currently trying to be filled, and make sure you know how long those have been vacant. It can really change the staffing picture if certain positions technically exist on paper but have been vacant for a period of months or years, which is not that uncommon. And then just to dig into that organizational strengths piece again, when we think about how to identify those, an important piece is thinking about, what is staff in general proud of? What are people excited about? Are there programs in other parts of the institution that have been really successful that you can model new programs on? That can be, an assessment of various skills that don't immediately feel like digital program or digital preservation skills. Maybe a certain decision-making or task force model worked really well for some other set of goals. And you can explicitly model some changes on that success. So then thinking about how you can direct the strengths internally towards improvement in preservation. The second facet in the assessment framework is staff and resources. A couple of these things will feel pretty obvious. Staffing levels and budgeting levels always come to top of mind if you ask people what they need in order to make changes in their program. A lot of times it is just more staff and more funding. And that is not unusual. It's also it's, very true in most institutions, but there are other things that we also want to pay attention to on top of how much staff and how much money there is. Whether that is how staff are oriented, what levels of professional development they are offered or supported in getting, how budgeting is done. There's, I've run across many institutions where one-time spending is fairly simple to acquire for a short-term project, but signing up for a license for a long-term software is extraordinarily challenging. So that might be a budgeting method or scheme that you have, thoughts on, and you would like an internal process to change. And that's not about different levels of money. That's not about more money. It's about how money is allocated. So that can still be very useful. And then thinking about what resources staff have in their professional communities and what resources the institution has in its peer community as well. So both at the staff and human level and at the institutional level, really trying to make explicit the professional supportive connections that exist, and mapping where there are needs that could be supported. So just a minute to think about that staffing versus staff roles piece. Staffing is going to really refer to how much, is there just not enough time being dedicated towards these tasks? That's often very true. But then sometimes there's also, how are we using our staff hours? Is too much of it going towards certain tasks and not enough towards other tasks? This happens frequently when we're thinking about digitization versus preservation tasks. There has, been a few decades of pushing towards more digital collections, and we're kind of on the catch up with the preservation actions piece. So what we want to do is start to think about, where are these tasks happening? Is there an imbalance? How would a more rational allocation of hours look? The staff roles, they are, in my experience, frequently misaligned with institutional priorities. So this is because of a lot of things, but my personal opinion is that job descriptions just grow sort of like in an ad hoc way as certain programs are started, tasks are added into people's jobs, and they are often assigned to people sort of based on non-programmatic reasons, like what building people work in versus what parts of the organization they actually have influence over. So, and then at the same time as all that ad hoc additional tasks are happening, there isn't a regular assessment of how job descriptions have changed and possibly tasks should be realigned across jobs in kind of a systematic, holistic way. So keep an eye out for tasks like that. I worked with a client once that they, because it sort of made sense to them internally in an office space way, all of their conservators were doing digital imaging as well as conservation. And those are vastly different skill sets. And it was a really inefficient use of highly skilled people. So just kind of identifying to them that that was probably costing them a lot of time and holding them back from expanding was a pretty important part of that consultation. So, just kind of trying to find things like that. And then thinking about the community of practice, asking your peer partner, and part of this assessment project is to build the community of practice. So you are now connecting with a partner, and also a larger community. But you have a pre-existing community of practice. These are, you know, even just listservs that you're a part of, conferences you go to regularly, people you know to ask questions of when you have questions. So starting to map that out in a way where you can see where the strengths are, where you might need to make new connections. And then thinking about how that can be a springboard for collaboration. And like I said, this is both on the individual level, but also at the institutional level. It's very important to try to map partnerships that exist, whether that's digital aggregation partners, you know, programming partners. A lot of times our museums and libraries are doing collaborative exhibiting or outreach. So starting to kind of think about those partnerships as not just something that has one specific outcome, but that can be cultivated into a supportive relationship over time. So our third facet is the policy infrastructure piece, which it only has 3 subsections, but this is a very meaty section. The first one is going to be collection development. There's usually a lot of work that institutions need to do in the collection development area for their digital collections. For various reasons, digitization efforts can be kind of ad hoc here and there based on different priorities from different parts of the institution, not necessarily based on a collecting strategy, which is what we like to see in both physical and digital collections, is a true strategy. So there's that piece. And it covers both born digital and digitized things. Then we get into selection for digitization specifically, because there are some format-based and risk-based selection methodologies that we like to incorporate. And, you know, we finish up with preservation planning, which is kind of that strategy for taking preservation actions, doing preservation tasks once the collection is already existing. Just digging into selection a little bit, you want to be thinking about how collections are prioritized for digitization or reformatting. And then also, how are you prioritizing collections for digital preservation? Not all digital collections have the same value to the institution. So thinking about prioritizing and how you might select different preservation actions for different priorities within the collection. That is, I would think that's a more longer term activity generally than what most of the assessment is going to be hitting. Our 4th section is processes and workflows. This is getting a little bit more down to the procedures that people put into daily practice. Reformatting is going to cover how things are digitized, whether that's AV, still image, whatever strange formats you might have, and really trying to look for consistency in these procedures. So identifying inconsistencies. In ingesting or acquiring born digital collections. So those are things that are created in a digital format from the beginning of their lifetime, and trying to get some consistent practices around preserving those. Metadata policies. And then getting at the culture of documentation within an institution. Documentation is how you tell people in the future what you did. So it's a pretty keystone piece of preservation, and it's actually kind of built into most of the assessment framework, but here is a place to call it out very specifically, to talk about documentation and the culture of documentation within an institution. Are people supported in taking time to actually log their their tasks, to create guidelines, to create written procedures, or is it more of a up in someone's head institutional knowledge thing? So that's why we call it out in this very specific way. Just to think a little bit more deeply about what you're looking for in the reformatting section, you want to be looking for some consistency and best practices that are in accordance with standards across the field. So we want to be ideally creating sustainable collections from the start. So this limits rework later, re-imaging or retransferring things. We want to try as much as possible, no matter where in the institution a digital project begins, to be creating a sustainable digital version according to internal policy, not according to whoever happens to be kind of planning it. So having an internal policy around digitization standards, and really basing those on appropriate standards and best practices across the field, so that interoperability is built into these collections. Something that I think I just always like to mention about Born Digital collections is that most of our institutions do create internal assets that are valuable and preservable over time. So that, can be a thing that happens with many places now is event recordings, podcasts, marketing posters, lots of outreach materials, various internal databases. So your own metadata creation, ensuring that those things are also being preserved as high value objects, things like that. So trying to remind your peer partner to really think broadly about what a Born Digital asset is and could be coming from. It's not always coming from outside the institution. And then the last piece of the assessment is, kind of finally digging into the technological infrastructure. But I hope that you'll see, and you have kind of already learned through some of the readings and working with your cohort facilitator, that much of the digital preservation work that we do is not actually digging into technological changes. A lot of it is policy and procedural changes and consistency, and just kind of the decision-making layer that needs to happen before things end up in the technological infrastructure. But the technological infrastructure is very important as well. So there's, a handful of subsections here. One of the more important ones is IT support. And I have just our last slide is about that. Working with legacy media is kind of, depending on what is in the collection. A lot of institutions now are dealing with more modern donations or transfers that include floppy disks, CD-ROMs, various zip disks, of those kinds of things. So trying to do a little bit of an assessment with how those are being handled. And then thinking about the tool and software infrastructure that's in place to handle data management, metadata, and digital objects. The storage infrastructure is a critical part of doing adequate preservation. So we have some questions about where things are stored, how they are managed and backed up, and what we would like to see as a minimum, like a minimum good practice for a storage architecture for things of value. And then we take a look at the very end at access to masters is really what we're concerned with here, not necessarily access copies that are provided to the public, but being able to track access to preservation copies, and making sure your collections are safeguarded from vandalism, deletion, changes, whether those are accidental or intentional, and making sure that if things are changed, there is a log of them. So like I said, I just wanted to kind of dig in real quick on IT support. Some areas that I think come up a lot are opportunities and limitations to self-supporting certain preservation technologies, you know, kind of delineating what the archives or collections manager should be supporting internally and what an IT vendor, whether that's external, totally contracted, or institutional, you know, what they should be helping to support. This is so highly dependent on the local context that it's just something to keep an eye out for. If possible, we love to see incorporating IT staff into policy and decision making, even if they are contracted. It's a specialist skill, and we would like to have their input when it comes to designing systems. This as well does intersect heavily with the staffing discussion, because we're looking at where does IT role end and collection manager role begins, making sure that there's not either a gap there or a duplication of effort. So this is an important section, obviously. So that just brings us to the end of this walkthrough. The next topic I'm going to have for you is on the framework, kind of the method of using the framework. So we'll talk about the discussion prompts, the idea banks, and how to think about priorities for action.